Hello dear students. Today, I want to share a story that I think will inspire you on your journey to learning English. You know, English is such a powerful language. It connects us to the world, opens doors to endless opportunities, and helps us share our ideas with people from different cultures. But let me ask you something. Have you ever felt stuck while learning English? Like no matter how hard you try, the words just won't come out or you don't understand what someone is saying. I completely understand how frustrating that can be because I've been there too. When I first started learning English, it felt like climbing a mountain without knowing the path. I remember sitting in a class and feeling completely lost. Everyone around me seemed to understand what the teacher was saying, but I couldn't follow. Even when I wanted to speak, I was afraid of making mistakes or sounding silly. Does that sound familiar to you? If it does, don't worry, you're not alone. And today, I want to tell you about someone who went through the same challenges but found a way to overcome them. This story isn't just about learning English. It's about believing in yourself and taking small steps toward big dreams. So, let's begin. I see what you mean. Let me start again and tell the story as if I'm speaking directly to your students. Let me tell you about a time when I was just like you, struggling to learn English. When I first started, I knew I needed to learn English, but I didn't really know how important it would be for my life. I didn't understand why it was so hard for me to understand everything and speak fluently. Every time I tried to speak, I felt nervous and afraid of making mistakes. You see, at that time, my dream was to connect with people from all over the world. I wanted to learn about different cultures, make new friends, and maybe even travel. But there was one huge obstacle: I didn't speak English very well. I knew that English was the bridge to all those dreams I had, and without it, it felt like I was stuck. I remember thinking, why is English so important? Why can't I just learn another language or communicate in my own way? But then, I realized something that changed everything. English wasn't just a language, it was a tool. It was the key to unlocking opportunities. I could read books, watch movies, and even talk to people in different countries. It was the language of business, travel, and so many other things I loved. So I made a decision. I told myself, if I really want to live the life I dream of, I have to learn English. It wasn't going to be easy, and I knew I would face challenges along the way, but I had a clear goal now. I wanted to speak English well enough to connect with others, share ideas, and even pursue a career that would require it. And that, my friends, is when my journey truly began. Do any of you feel the same way? Do you have a dream that requires you to improve your English? Whether it's traveling, finding a job, or simply connecting with more people, I want you to remember, learning English is a tool that can help you achieve anything you set your mind to. So let's get started, because just like me, you can make your dreams come true with English. Now, I want to be honest with you, learning English was not easy. In fact, it was full of challenges that made me doubt myself at times. And I know many of you may be facing similar struggles right now. You might feel the same fear and frustration that I did, and I want you to know that it's completely normal. Every language learner faces challenges, but those challenges can be overcome, and that's what makes the journey worth it. So let me tell you about the first major challenge Emma, or rather, myself, faced. The first one was a big one: confidence. When I started learning English, I felt like a beginner in every sense of the word. I would look around at my classmates or others who spoke fluently, and I felt like I would never reach that level. It seemed like no matter how many words I learned or how much I practiced, I was still not able to speak with the ease and confidence that I admired in others. I remember one time, I had a conversation with someone who spoke English very well, and I couldn't find the right words. I started feeling nervous, and the more nervous I became, the more my mind went blank. I had all these ideas in my head, but the words wouldn't come out the way I wanted them to. It felt like every time I tried to speak, I was trapped by my own thoughts and fears. And do you know what happened next? I made a mistake. And it wasn't a small mistake either. I said something completely wrong. I was so embarrassed, and I could feel my face turning red. I wanted to run away from the conversation and hide. But that's when I realized that this was one of the biggest obstacles I had to overcome, my own fear of making mistakes. At that moment, I thought to myself, why am I so afraid of making mistakes? Isn't that how we learn? The truth was, I had a fear of speaking. I was terrified that I would say something wrong and people would laugh or judge me. I didn't want to sound silly. But here's the thing, every single person who speaks English fluently has made mistakes along the way. That's how we learn. It's all part of the process. I had to learn to embrace my mistakes instead of running away from them. So, I started to focus less on the fear of making mistakes and more on the idea of learning through practice. The more I practiced speaking, the less afraid I became. Eventually, I realized that making mistakes wasn't something to be ashamed of, it was actually a sign that I was learning. But even when I started to overcome my fear of speaking, there were still other struggles I had to deal with. The next challenge was understanding the language. For the longest time, I couldn't understand everything that was being said to me. I'd listen to people speak in English, and it would feel like they were speaking a completely different language, words blended together, and sentences seemed to fly right over my head. I didn't know what they meant, and I often had to ask them to repeat themselves. It was frustrating. I would watch movies or listen to podcasts in English, and even though I knew the words, I couldn't always follow the conversations. It was like I knew what each word meant, but the flow of the language was still confusing. One of the biggest struggles I faced was understanding phrasal verbs. You know, expressions like get over, take off, or put up with. In my own language, we didn't use expressions like that, so I didn't understand them at all. It was so frustrating. I would hear them in conversations, but they didn't make sense to me. It felt like there was a whole other level to the language that I couldn't access yet. And it wasn't just the vocabulary. Sometimes, when I was speaking with native English speakers, they spoke so quickly that I couldn't keep up. They would use slang, idioms, and words that were unfamiliar to me. My brain would race, trying to catch up, and I would often feel overwhelmed. It felt like there was this invisible wall between me and the fluency I was trying to achieve. I would listen, nod, smile, and pretend to understand, but inside, I felt like I was failing. Every conversation seemed like a challenge, and it was hard not to feel discouraged. Another major struggle I faced was maintaining motivation. There were days when I didn't feel like studying. There were days when I felt like I had reached a plateau, and no matter how much I practiced, I wasn't improving as fast as I wanted to. I had days when I wanted to give up. I thought, maybe I'm just not good at this. Maybe English wasn't for me. I'd see other people progressing faster than me and I'd compare myself to them. And when I did that, I would feel frustrated. I would think, why can't I learn as quickly as they are? But what I didn't realize at the time was that everyone learns at their own pace. Some people learn faster, others slower, but as long as you keep moving forward, you're making progress. One of the hardest moments came when I had to have a conversation in English with a stranger. I had been practicing for months, but when the moment finally came, I froze. I couldn't remember the vocabulary I had learned, and I was terrified that I would say something completely wrong. I remember stumbling through the conversation, feeling my heart race and my palms sweat. I was thinking, what if they don't understand me? What if they think I'm not good enough? But in that moment, something amazing happened. I kept going. I didn't give up. I may not have spoken perfectly, but I was trying. And do you know what? The person I was speaking to understood me. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about making an effort and keeping the conversation going. Despite all the struggles, I kept reminding myself why I started this journey. Every time I felt like giving up, I reminded myself of my dreams. I remembered the reason why I wanted to learn English in the first place. I wanted to connect with people, explore new cultures, and find opportunities for myself and for my future. So, yes, learning English was hard. It was full of struggles, frustrations, and moments where I felt like I wasn't good enough. But I kept going, and little by little, those struggles began to feel like less of a barrier. As time passed, I noticed that I was improving. The more I faced my fears, the more confident I became. The more I practiced, the easier it was to understand. And slowly, the obstacles that once seemed impossible began to feel like small steps in the right direction. If you're facing similar struggles right now, I want you to know that you're not alone. Every learner goes through this. And the key is to keep going, even when it feels difficult. The more you practice, the better you'll become. The more mistakes you make, the more you'll learn. And soon, you'll look back and realize that all of those struggles were just part of your journey to becoming fluent. So don't be afraid to face your challenges head on. Embrace them, learn from them, and keep moving forward. The road to fluency may not always be easy, but it's absolutely worth it. Now, even though learning English was full of challenges, there came a moment when everything started to shift. It didn't happen overnight, and it certainly didn't come without struggle. But eventually, I found something that made all the difference in my learning journey. Something that reignited my passion and gave me the strength to push through all the difficulties I was facing. Up until that point, I was feeling lost. Every day felt like an uphill battle. I was learning new words, but they didn't seem to stick. I was practicing speaking, but I still stumbled over my words. I would listen to native speakers and get discouraged because I couldn't understand everything they said. I felt stuck. And like many of you, I began to wonder if all the hard work was really worth it. But one day, something happened that changed everything. It was a rainy afternoon, and I was sitting in a small cafe, trying to study on my own. I had my notebook open in front of me, scribbling down new vocabulary words, trying to memorize grammar rules. I was frustrated. I had been studying for hours, but I felt like I wasn't making any real progress. I was on the verge of giving up, questioning whether I was ever going to get better. That's when I overheard a conversation at the next table. A group of people was talking in English. One of them was a native speaker, and the others were learners, just like me. They were laughing and chatting, and at first, I didn't think much of it. But then something caught my attention. One of the learners was speaking with such ease, even though their accent was strong and they made a few mistakes. But they didn't seem embarrassed. They were speaking confidently and having a good time. I could tell that they were still learning, but they were not letting their mistakes stop them. And as I listened, something clicked inside me. I realized that this was the kind of attitude I needed. I didn't need to be perfect. I didn't need to speak flawlessly. I just needed to practice and speak confidently, just like they were doing. That's when I decided I needed to find a different approach. I couldn't keep doing the same things I had been doing and expect different results. I needed to be more proactive and find resources that could truly help me overcome my struggles. Around that time, I remembered something someone had told me earlier: you can't learn English on your own if you don't surround yourself with English every day. Those words stuck with me. I realized that I had been studying in isolation. Sure, I had books and apps, but I wasn't actively using English in my daily life. I was only practicing when I had time, and that wasn't enough. I needed to change my routine. I needed to find ways to immerse myself in the language, even outside of study time. So, I started looking for new ways to surround myself with English. I knew I needed to hear it more, speak it more, and practice in ways that felt natural. I didn't want to just study English in a classroom setting or with textbooks. I wanted to live it. That's when I discovered podcasts. I began listening to English podcasts during my daily commute. These weren't just language learning podcasts, they were real, everyday conversations on a variety of topics. Some were interviews with interesting people, others were stories about life in different countries. I would listen intently, trying to catch every word, even if I didn't understand everything. I would pause, rewind, and listen again, repeating what I heard. Sometimes I couldn't catch every word, but I started to get the rhythm of the language, and that was the turning point. Listening to those podcasts helped me feel more connected to the language, and it made me realize that English wasn't just about learning rules, it was about understanding real people and real conversations. But that's not all. I also started to read more in English. At first, I tried reading books that were a bit too advanced for me, and it was tough. I would come across so many unfamiliar words that it was discouraging. But then I decided to start with simpler materials, short stories, news articles, and even children's books. Reading became my secret weapon. It was amazing how much I improved just by reading stories that I enjoyed. I would underline words I didn't understand, look them up, and try to remember them for the next time. Slowly but surely, I began to recognize more words and phrases, and my vocabulary expanded in ways I hadn't expected. And here's where the real turning point happened. I decided to join an English-speaking group. Up until that point, I had been avoiding speaking with others because I was afraid of making mistakes. But one day, after hearing that group in the cafe and realizing that everyone makes mistakes, I took a deep breath and joined an online group. It was a simple conversation group, where people from all around the world came together to practice English. I was nervous at first. I wasn't sure what to expect. But as soon as I joined the call, I felt a wave of excitement. There were people from different countries, each speaking English in their own way. Some had strong accents, others spoke fluently, but everyone was learning together. The first conversation was nerve-wracking, but something incredible happened. I spoke. Even though I stumbled, even though I made mistakes, I didn't stop. I kept going. And do you know what? No one laughed at me. In fact, they encouraged me. They made me feel comfortable. This was a huge turning point for me. I realized that speaking English wasn't about being perfect, it was about communicating. It didn't matter if I made mistakes. The important thing was that I was trying, and I was connecting with others. That made me feel more confident than I ever had before. And then I met someone in that group who became my mentor, an experienced English speaker who had been learning other languages for years. This person shared some valuable tips with me. They told me that the most important thing to focus on wasn't grammar or vocabulary alone, it was consistency. They advised me to practice every single day, even if it was just for a few minutes. They said the more you practice, the better you'll get, they said. This simple piece of advice completely changed the way I approached my studies. I started to make English a part of my daily routine. I would speak with my mentor whenever I could, listen to podcasts during breakfast, read articles at lunch and chat with friends in the evening. It was hard at first, but I started to see results. The more I immersed myself in the language, the more natural it felt. My confidence grew, and my ability to understand and speak English improved in ways I never thought possible. This was my turning point. I found motivation through surrounding myself with English, learning from others, and embracing my mistakes as part of the process. It wasn't magic and it wasn't easy, but I found the tools that worked for me. And that made all the difference. If you're struggling right now, remember that the turning point might be just around the corner for you too. Whether it's finding new resources, joining a group, or simply shifting your mindset, there is always a way to push past the challenges. Keep looking, keep trying, and eventually, you'll find the spark that will ignite your motivation and push you forward in your English learning journey. As I continued my journey to learn English, I began to realize that success wasn't just about working hard, it was about working smart. I had spent so much time trying to force my way through the language, studying grammar rules and memorizing vocabulary, without truly understanding what was going to help me improve in the long run. But as I faced my challenges and turned the corner, I discovered a few key strategies that truly made a difference in my learning process. These strategies were simple, but they made all the difference in helping me improve and overcome my struggles. Let me share these with you, and I hope they can help you 2. One of the most important things I learned during my English learning journey was that consistency is absolutely crucial. It's not about studying for hours every single day, it's about making English a part of your daily routine. Even if it's just for 10 to 15 minutes, practicing every day will build up over time. It's like exercising, the more consistently you work out, the stronger and healthier you become. The same goes for language learning. In my case, I started setting aside a specific time every day to practice English. Whether it was in the morning over breakfast, during my lunch break, or before going to bed, I made sure to dedicate time to English practice. Some days, I spent time learning new vocabulary. Other days, I focused on listening exercises or reading stories. But the key was that I didn't let any day pass without doing something to improve my skills. One of the strategies I used to stay consistent was to create a learning schedule. It didn't have to be strict, but it was a way for me to make sure I was covering all areas of language learning: speaking, listening, reading, and writing. For example, Mondays were for listening to podcasts, Tuesdays were for reading stories, Wednesdays for speaking practice, and so on. Breaking my study time into small, manageable chunks helped me stay on track without feeling overwhelmed. You don't need hours and hours every day, just a few minutes consistently will lead to huge progress over time. Listening became one of my favorite and most effective tools in improving my English. It helped me develop my listening skills and gave me exposure to real-life English conversations. As I mentioned earlier, I started listening to podcasts every day. These were English podcasts that weren't specifically for language learners. They were more natural, everyday conversations between native speakers or interviews with interesting people. At first, it was hard. I couldn't catch everything, and sometimes I felt lost in the conversation. But I didn't let that discourage me. One of the most important things I did was listen actively. Instead of just playing the podcast and letting it fade into the background, I really focused on it. I tried to catch as many words as I could, and when I didn't understand something, I would rewind and listen again. If there was a phrase or word I didn't know, I would pause the podcast, look it up, and repeat it to myself. This helped me expand my vocabulary, while improving my ability to understand how words were used in context. It made listening feel much more rewarding. Another tip that helped me was listening to the same episode more than once. The first time I would listen just to get the general idea. The second time, I would focus on specific words and phrases. The third time, I would repeat the phrases aloud to practice pronunciation. This repetition really helped me reinforce what I had learned and increased my retention of the material. There are countless podcasts available for all levels of English learners, so find one that interests you. Whether it's about science, history, technology, or entertainment, listening to topics you enjoy will keep you motivated and make the language learning feel less like a chore and more like a fun activity. Another key strategy one used to improve my English was reading. Reading allowed me to see how English was structured, how sentences were formed, and how vocabulary was used in different contexts. I started with simple stories, things like children's books or short articles, and as I became more comfortable, I moved on to more complex materials like novels, news websites, and blogs. One of the best things about reading is that it gave me a way to naturally pick up new vocabulary. Every time I came across a word I didn't understand, would highlight it, look it up, and try to use it in a sentence. I even kept a notebook where I wrote down new words and their meanings. This helped me keep track of my progress and made sure I wasn't forgetting what I had learned. I also discovered that reading aloud was extremely beneficial. Speaking while reading helped me practice my pronunciation, and it also improved my fluency. The more I read, the easier it became to recognize sentence structures and vocabulary. Eventually, reading in English started to feel more natural. A powerful reading tool I used was graded readers, books specifically designed for language learners. These books are written at different levels of proficiency, so you can find books that match your current level. This allowed me to enjoy reading without feeling overwhelmed by too many unfamiliar words. But here's something I've realized: it's not just about reading a lot, it's about reading with purpose. Don't just rush through materials, take your time to truly absorb the language. Ask yourself, what did I learn from this? Or, what new words can I use next time I speak? This approach helps you connect more deeply with the language and improves your retention. Perhaps the most important strategy one used was speaking. I know this is where many learners struggle the most, and it's no surprise. It's easy to be afraid of making mistakes. But if I could go back and give myself one piece of advice when I was learning English, it would be this: speak as much as possible, even if you're afraid of making mistakes. This is the fastest way to improve. The reason why speaking is so important is because it helps you build confidence. For a long time, I was afraid to speak English because I thought I would make a fool of myself. But the more I practiced speaking with others, the more I realized that everyone makes mistakes. No one expects you to speak perfectly, especially if you're just learning. The important thing is to keep trying. I started by joining online conversation groups and speaking with others who were learning English just like me. This gave me a safe space to practice and made me feel more comfortable with speaking. I would talk about simple topics at first, like my hobbies, what I did during the day, or what I liked to eat. These conversations helped me get used to thinking in English and speaking spontaneously without overthinking every word. In addition to the online groups, I also sought out language exchange partners. These were native English speakers who wanted to learn my language, and we would meet regularly to practice. Sometimes we spoke for an hour in English, then switched to my language for the next hour. This gave me the chance to practice with someone who was patient and supportive. It helped me realize that speaking is about communication, not perfection. The more I spoke, the better I got, and soon I started to feel like I could express myself more naturally. Another way I practiced speaking was through shadowing. This technique involves listening to a short audio clip, perhaps a sentence or a conversation, and then repeating it aloud exactly as you hear it. It helps you improve pronunciation, fluency, and rhythm. I would listen to a podcast or a video, pause it, and then repeat what I heard. I did this several times, trying to match the speaker's tone, speed, and pronunciation. Over time, this method helped me speak more fluidly. Finally, I cannot underestimate the power of writing. Writing in English is a great way to practice vocabulary and sentence structure. I started writing a journal every day. I would write about anything, my day, my thoughts, what I had learned. It didn't matter what I wrote, the key was to write regularly. I started off by writing just a few sentences, but as my confidence grew, my writing became longer and more complex. This helped me practice forming sentences and using new words I had learned through reading or listening. Writing also helped me organize my thoughts in English. When I first started, I had trouble expressing myself in writing. But as I wrote more, I became more comfortable with how English sentences were structured. It also gave me a chance to practice grammar without the pressure of speaking. So, these were the strategies I used to overcome my struggles and make real progress in my English journey. Practice consistently every day, immerse yourself in the language through listening, reading, and speaking, and don't be afraid to make mistakes. Keep pushing yourself to try new things, find resources that keep you motivated, and most importantly, remember that every step forward counts. These strategies may take time to show results, but with persistence, you'll start seeing improvement in ways you didn't expect. The journey to fluency is a marathon, not a sprint, and every small effort you make will bring you closer to your goal.